begin. I'm Greg Guma, and this is the panel discussion on independent politics, movement, and party. And just by way of introduction briefly, that this is a dialogue that obviously was going on this morning in a way, and has been going on for decades. And in fact, there was a similar panel at the 1981 Solidarity Conference. It had a slightly different title, but it was on the same basic topic. One of the differences, however, I recall this because I was the moderator of that discussion as well, oddly enough, was that at that time we were discussing to a great extent whether to work within the Democratic Party, quote unquote, take it over, or whether it was worth saving or whether to move outside of it. That was the dynamic of that time, and I have a sense that the times are different and that the dynamic here is going to be different today. And so the task of this panel is to discuss whether we can and how we can combine movement building on the one hand with the development of some kind of formal political organization. And it's a very difficult question, and one that's been concerning and dogging activists in Vermont for at least 20 years. And I say 20 years because it's almost 20 years since the formation of the Liberty Union Party, which still exists in Vermont. And just out of curiosity, Just out of curiosity, how many people who are here worked on some Liberty Union campaign in the past? If you could just sort of raise your hands if you have. And how many people voted for a Liberty Union candidate?
This time.
This time, okay.
No.
At some point, okay. So quite a few out of this group, and I would say that's probably true of the conference as a whole. For a while, Liberty Union did embody many of our hopes for a political party that would be rooted in a movement for fundamental social change. But since the 70s, things have changed. There have been many other attempts to harmonize the demands for a movement and for a party. The Citizens Party, the Progressive Coalition, the Rainbow Coalition, the Greens, among others. And this is a diversity which I think is one of our strengths, but also could represent a strategic weakness because it makes it difficult if we're serious about creating an organization within movements which can challenge the fundamental power relations in Vermont or beyond Vermont. And I think the panelists are going to have a lot to say on this topic. The format, basically, to answer the gentleman's questions and panelists, I've asked the panelists to think about a few questions and make very brief remarks. I think 5 minutes at the maximum in most cases, before we open it to a general discussion. And I asked them to think about these questions. Can we build a democratic and participatory movement while also seeking or holding elective office? How can we balance the demands of movement building with the need for some formal political organization? And what kind of organization should that be? The panelists have strong experience and views, beginning over to my right, Terry Bouricius, who was active in the Liberty Union Party in the 70s, and then became the first Citizens Party candidate elected to office in the nation when he ran for Burlington alderman in 1981. He served on the city council for 8 years, 1 year as board president, and has worked closely with Mayor Sanders. And I believe remains committed to building a strong movement outside the two-party system. Sandy Baird has been an activist in Burlington for many years, a lawyer who's acted in the interests of women and the poor, outspoken activist, and most recently ran for mayor of Burlington as a Greens candidate. Ted Glick, immediately to my right, I met actually about 8 years ago, I believe, when we were talking about forming an organization which he now leads, the National Committee for Independent Political Action. At that time it was more of a vision, and since then it has been helpful to many organizations inside and outside the Democratic Party. And he's worked hard and knows quite a bit about the difficulties of the inside-outside strategy. When I first talked to Howie Hawkins about this panel, the first name that he suggested and someone he felt was had been an inspiration to him was Eric Chester, who's over on my left, who has worked extensively on the relationship between socialism and running for office and I believe has been an inspiration to many people through his writing. Brian Tokar, also a writer, is known for recently for his book, The Green Alternative, his articles in Zeta Magazine and others. But I also remember Brian when he was in Burlington, and although he was a person who was not very enamored of electoral politics at that time, still worked on campaigns to re-elect Bernie Sanders and Alders, despite having serious tactical differences with them. And finally, Barbara Nolfi, over on the end on my left, who currently is carrying a very daunting task, which is to both sit on the Burlington City Council and to coordinate, as one of the co-chairs, the Progressive Coalition, which is as close as we come in Burlington to having a third party, a formal third party. I could say more about all of them, but rather than do that, I want to simply ask Barbara to begin and ask her whether she thinks we can build both a movement and a party, and whether we should do that and how we could do it.
I'm just going to sit down here because I'm a little uncomfortable with this setup. As Greg introduced me, I'm Barbara Nolfi. I've lived in and worked in Vermont since 1969. I was part of the big commune movement, Back to the Land, in the 69, 70, 71. I helped start the People's Free Clinic, which was a volunteer clinic that I've associated with for a few years, and have been politically active since then. When I ran for office in 1988, I had been active in the Progressive Coalition, but no amount of activity to the extent that I've had since then. And just in a general context, I wasn't here for the first plenary session, but looking around me at what the imperialists who run our country, the imperialist running dogs who run our country, have done to our country is alarming. And the work on all fronts is awesome. We look at the environment, we look at the human environment inside that environment, the fact that there's not enough housing, there's not enough food, there are hungry people, there are people without homes, there are families homeless. It just seems that our system is totally broken down and is not able to address that. And I see that the major parties, the Democrats and Republican parties, have also not been able to break us out of the hold that the imperialists have on our lives. I joined the Progressive Coalition and became active with that group of very independent thinking people, and have found it a challenge. It's very much of a challenge to be part of a progressive movement and have your private life and be on the board of aldermen. When I think about independent politics or independent movement, should I drop out of electoral politics and become active in one or another of the many ways I could be active? I do have real questions about electoral politics. But I feel like being in the electoral arena gives us a wide audience that we would not otherwise have access to. That on the local level, and I have to differentiate here between local politics at the ward level, as we have in our towns and cities, at the state level, where we all vote in districts, and at national level, where the conventions seem to be the real decision makers. On the local level, being part of electoral politics, you really get out and talk to people. You find out what's on their minds. You begin to know who can be active, who can be empowered, who you can bring out and say, let's work together on this project. And knowing that if they begin to work for change, they're enlisted. They'll begin to realize that what we have here is a real they'll run up against the problems. They'll begin to see very concretely the same kinds of things that those of us who have been working for years have already seen and grappled with. On a state level, I think that you're more removed from that kind of process, and I think it's more of a challenge to stay in touch with what people really think, with having a forum that relates down to the grassroots. So I guess that just to kind of sum up where I feel like independent politics needs to be and a movement is to learn to make that connection between people and their problems and getting something done. And I think that serving, at least on the local level where the independents and progressives have served in Burlington, we really have a chance to begin to affect that kind of change.
Terry, want to continue?
I guess first I would want to see a show of hands if is there anybody here who feels that we should not be engaged in electoral politics at all, that's reformism or whatever, and we should be engaged in direct action exclusively? Is there anybody who have to make that argument? Yeah, I didn't think so. So I'm going to cut out that part of my talk to try and persuade you why we should engage in electoral politics. Because I must admit I have doubts sometimes, but I basically feel that in this country, if you're not engaging in electoral politics, a large segment of the population will dismiss you as not engaging in politics, period. That it's the only game in town, and even though the board is rigged, we go ahead and play. First off, I just wanted to say that grassroots is often referred to in a sort of a wistful way by leftists, like if only we had grassroots connections. And I just sort of want to encourage people to realize that we are the grassroots. In Burlington, for example, my direct experience with electoral politics, sometimes we'll have a meeting in someone's house and think, well, we need grassroots involvement. And here we are, a meeting of 15 people who cover a 20-block area. And that's about as grassroots as you're going to get in any organization in the country. Involvement from union activists, union organizers, women's movement, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that is reflected in town after town in Vermont. There are individual places where we are so isolated in some of the rural areas where we don't feel like a grassroot because we're a single blade of grass. But by and large, I would like to dispel that idea that somehow we're an intellectual group off in the clouds. I think in Vermont, by and large, we have a grassroots movement. One of the issues that is raised is, should we be participating with the Democratic Party? I was one of the people who stood out as long as I could against the let's go and vote for Jesse Jackson at the Democratic caucus in Burlington argument. The only reason I even was finally persuaded to do that was that the chair of the Democratic committee in Burlington specifically invited the Progressive Coalition people to come, saying, we know you're not part of the party, you would not be considered interlopers, please come, because she happened to be a Jackson supporter, I guess. But fundamentally, I don't think that I can be persuaded that the Democratic Party can be a vehicle for significant social change. I'm not sure what vehicle can be used, but I'm convinced that the Democratic and Republican Party cannot be. They have clearly stated in their faith values that capitalism is a good and a value to be protected. By definition, the Democratic Party says this is one of our goals, to protect and preserve a system which allows individuals through corporate power to dominate the lives of others. That's not how they phrase it, but that's in essence what it is. Free enterprise and the free world, if it means nothing else, means the freedom to invest and to make profits off other people's labor. So with that underpinning of the Democratic Party, I'm skeptical as to how people could argue that we could use it. People said, well, you can take over the Democratic local organization. Just go to the caucus and take it over. It just takes 3 people in a small town. Say, yeah, you can do that, but why bother? Because the reality is the Democratic local organizations and town committees and state committees have no power. They're completely powerless. All they are is vehicles of expression of a power elite. If working class people who are of a progressive mind, independent mind, actually had a majority control of the Democratic Party in this state, it would simply be ignored by the power elite. I mean, the reality is that by law they have no power. They can't even put forth candidates. Candidates are put forth by money and by petition and by primary elections where 20% of the people bother to vote. And those are usually the best connected people with the most influence and feel like the system already serves their needs. And finally, in terms of the argument about a Democrat, well, so you can get an individual Democrat, a good Democrat who's a progressive, even a socialist can get elected if they run with the Democratic label. And my argument is that even if they manage to get elected, 10 years from now, that's probably not going to amount to anything. because it's going to be lost in the wash of what happened, because they go there and they still have the connections, and no one really understands that anything fundamental happened. Because the kind of change we need in this country has got to be more rapid than that. We go on changing as fast as we can. Maybe it's not very fast, but we have to hope that at some point there's going to be one of those historic opportunities where change suddenly accelerates. It happens throughout history, throughout every civilization. There have been moments where there's been rapid change, revolution. We have to count and hope that we're going to have one of those opportunities in our lifetimes, otherwise we may not have a planet. But we have to work with that assumption. But if you elect a Democrat who's a good person, you've got one more good person, but that doesn't accelerate any change. If you elect one person who is a radical independent, who suddenly in public's minds, like, you've broken a barrier, and people can suddenly realize that it's possible to have rapid change. In Burlington, when Bernie got elected, when I got elected, there was a whole mind shift. Maybe what we were able to accomplish with only 2 votes in the Board of Aldermen and the mayor's seat was not earth-shattering, but the mindset of thousands of people in Burlington was shifted permanently. People said, oh, you can buck the system. You can run outside the Democratic Party. You can challenge capitalism. I didn't know you were allowed to do that in this country. I thought it was illegal. But we've been able to make that transition. I'm probably going on a little bit too long here, so I'll just try and wrap up by saying the key thing, I think, is working for an electoral politics which expands the realm of what politics is. What I mean by that is politicians traditionally ignore most areas that actually affect people's lives the most. Their employer, the pollution put out by corporations, the mentality that is created by the consumerist society, their housing, if they're a tenant, et cetera, et cetera. These areas, politicians by and large say, that's the private sector. We don't deal with those issues. We deal with, like, people who extol town democracy and Vermont tradition of town meeting, whether to put road salt on the road or ash. That's the kinds of issues that we have power over. And democracy is made very, very pale, very, very insignificant, to the point that a majority of Americans do not vote. They're not dumb. They're not being irresponsible. They're being wise because they realize that they only are going to spend their personal energy on things that are important. They recognize that politics, as defined in this country, is not important because politics is prescribed to these limited areas while excluding the large areas. We have to take the role of saying politics has to include talking about workplace democracy, democracy in the schools, extending rights of every person to have a say in any decision that affects their lives, not just votes every 2 or 4 years for candidates that are virtually alike. And so that's what we try and do in Burlington, to try and expand the realm of what is politics. Politics means a lot more than just elections. And obviously I agree with what Howie Hawkins said this morning about the need to have a local movement tied in with elections, that you can't just have the electoral, you can't just have direct action, you need to have both. Otherwise, either one by itself is a failure.
Brian.
Okay, I guess what I want to do is say a little bit about the experience historically of the Green Movement internationally and nationally, and some of the lessons that brings to how we think about these kinds of questions. And if there's one main point that I want to try to bring into this discussion as somebody who's somewhat of a skeptic around the whole question of electoral involvement, not somebody who's opposed to it, but who really feels that there are a lot of questions that are left unanswered by an approach that emphasizes the electoral arena. To what extent can that be a component of a movement that's oriented toward popular initiative being the priority, a movement driven by popular initiative rather than one that sees people as sources of votes or sources of help when they're needed, but not actively engaged in a day-to-day level in politics? And I see the grassroots as everybody in one sense, but also particularly as including the people who don't primarily see themselves in terms of their own personal identification as activists. And I think the success or failure of a movement is based to a large extent on to what degree those people, which is the overwhelming majority of people, really feel engaged in the work of the movement. In the early 80s, when the Greens started becoming known for electoral successes around Europe, that created a lot of opportunities and also some serious dilemmas for people in this country. It reinforced a lot of illusions that it's possible to change things by working within the system, especially people in the ecology movement and in the peace movement, which were the main contributors to the development of the Greens in Europe. The successes, quote unquote, of the Greens gave a new legitimacy to certain approaches to working within the system. Now, in Germany, what the Greens were able to accomplish is really carrying out, at least at the beginning, a strategy of being inside and outside the system at the same time, being in their own minds, and I think successfully so, again at the beginning, spokespeople and representatives of the street movements in the electoral arena, not seeing themselves as having any independent legitimacy as politicians or aspiring to such. They were able to put out a multi-issue radical program that significantly shifted the terms of debate. In this country, to a large extent, the idea of a green movement has, to many people, enhanced the tendency that we already have to deal with of progressive people engaged in electoral work, often in a way that's really divorced from the kind of grassroots street politics that I'm trying to hint at. And to some extent has also reinforced in the minds of people who think of themselves as progressives the possibility of our being able to put ourselves in the position of administering reforms from the top. I could go on about the differences, but just to say briefly, besides the 5% rule in the parliamentary democracies of Europe, where a party that gets over 5% of the vote is entitled to seats in the legislative bodies, locally, nationally, what have you, in Europe there's been a much more uninterrupted history of the development of social movements, and the Green movement was able to evolve out of the peace and anti-nuclear movements and citizen initiative movements in Germany that really spanned a whole spectrum of concerns, whereas here, over the last 15 years or so, we're increasingly up against a tremendous amount of fragmentation politically, the loss of a sense of real political culture on the street level, and the loss of the kind of sense of empowerment that made it possible for people to feel that they could change things by being politically engaged 20 or 25 years ago. What that's resulted in is this whole style of administrative radicalism, of movements whose primary focus is to get people to help out with electoral campaigns, and that's just not enough. That kind of politics creates a whole series of dilemmas. People in this country distrust politicians, and accessible politicians are really ultimately going to be distrusted as much as any others because of their basic role in administering the system on its own terms and cooperation with that. In Vermont, we have the kind of access to the channels of power that exist that creates a lot of possibilities for people feeling like we can really change things, but also creates tremendous dangers in reinforcing the sense of illusions that we can create fundamental change by a strategy that exclusively works within the system. What's missing from that kind of politics are a whole area of things that the Green movement inherits from the New Left, and some things that the Green movement has contributed uniquely. Ideas of an active relationship between fundamental political change and transformation on the personal level. The idea of fundamental opposition to the system, not just finding ways to change the way it's administered. Getting to the root of problems, being radicals in the genuine sense of getting to the roots of problems. And in the ecology movement, that means trying to understand the social and political roots of ecological and environmental problems, and also really trying to get to the bottom of the roots of broader social problems in the historical alienation between people in the natural world that's evolved over the evolution of the civilization. Now, in times of crisis, we always see exceptions to that kind of politics as usual. And in Vermont, situations such as the threat of siting of nuclear waste dumps in Vermont, the whole controversy in southern Vermont, especially around the gas pipeline, the anti-toxics movement that Teresa talked about at length this morning, a lot of local initiatives around questions of growth and development, farmers in the Cabot Co-op organizing to prevent genetically engineered growth hormones from getting into the milk supply. At times of where people are personally up against threats on their lives that can't be ignored, people rise to the surface in a way that transcends some of the old divisions between people who think of themselves as activists and people who don't. And what I want to argue is that we need to create the kinds of models of grassroots empowerment that get beyond simple reformism and that can create the kind of structures that make it possible for people to work that way on a much more ongoing basis. And what it gets down to is what I said at the beginning, the idea of a movement that's driven by popular initiative, not by whatever machinations the people engaged in working within the system feel need to happen in order to get one piece of legislation through, or in order to get the right people on TV, or what have you. That the real needs of people working to try to change their lives is the fundamental thing that drives the direction of the movement. And that's something that I think we're missing to a large degree. I'm running out of time, so I just want to leave people with the question of to what extent can electoral involvement enhance rather than diminish that kind of possibility.
When I talked with Greg over lunch, he told me that I was going to be the only person on the panel with the perspective that the Democratic Party was a vehicle for change. So I wanted to first make clear that is not the perspective that I have or the perspective of my organization, the National Committee for Independent Political Action. Our view is that the process of building an independent movement that can become a national independent party is one that's going to involve a number of things, but two of them are these. One, that we need to build on local levels the organizational forms, the coalitions, the third parties, whatever, that are clearly independent of the two established structures that are involved in both supporting candidates for office and involved in active work on issues, the issues that are affecting people locally. That we need to be doing that on the one hand, and that's definitely a priority, a top priority. At the same time, that we work with people who are within the Democratic Party, including at some points supporting candidates who are running as Democrats, if on the basic programmatic issues and if in terms of just the assessment of the situation, they are people who deserve our support. And I want to point to the example of Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition, both for some positive and some negative lessons. From our standpoint, the Jackson campaign, and this was spoken to this morning, so I don't want to say too much about this, don't want to be repetitive. The Jackson campaign in 1984 and also in 1988, although they were two very different animals, the 1988 campaign was much more dominated, quite frankly, by black elected Democrats than the 1984 campaign. There was a difference. At the same time, in the 1988 campaign, Jesse Jackson was putting forward a perspective that spoke much more strongly to issues of class, to issues of the impact of the multinational, the transnational corporations on people in this country and around the world, and in that sense was politically stronger. But we felt and did feel that those campaigns were very important in generating a dynamic, a movement, a momentum, and in showing that there is a basis for a national independent movement organization party. We think, and it also is very significant, and I'll come back to this a little further on, but that movement very much came out of the African American community and was led by African American people. We think, looking at history in this country, speaking again nationally, and I know the Vermont reality is different, but speaking nationally, it's when black people have moved that there's been a great deal that's been shaken up in the society. It was true in the civil rights movement in the 50s when the black movement in the South essentially, in the view of many people, broke the back of McCarthyism and broke through the fear and the intimidation of the McCarthy period and gave an energy and a revitalization to many different movements that have continued to grow since that time. And we see it, we think, most recently in the impact of the Jackson campaign on progressive politics and politics in this country. So our position is not that the Democratic Party can be taken over, but we think that out of the interaction of people who are clearly independent and who do not see either of the two parties as hopeful or transformable, out of the interaction of those people with people in the Democratic Party, including candidates for office, who are articulating a strong progressive platform, who will work with us, who will work with people on the left, who won't red bait us or put us at arm's length, that out of that interaction over a period of time, we think, from our perspective, that there will emerge an independent party outside of the two-party system that will have the breadth, that will have the massivity, and will have the effectiveness to really challenge for power. That's the first point I wanted to make. Secondly, quickly, Greg mentioned the question. When Greg sent the questions that he wanted us to address, I thought a lot about this question of can you build a democratic and participatory movement while seeking or holding an elective office. And I'll use again the example of the National Rainbow Coalition because I guess as most people are aware, 3 months ago a decision was made by the National Board of the Rainbow Coalition that we fought against, that NCEPA members, including Dave Dellinger sitting over here, many of us around the country actively fought against and struggled against. And that decision was to essentially turn the rainbow into a campaign committee, in the words of Jesse Jackson, a campaign committee for his 1992 presidential campaign. We fought that because our view that we've been putting forward very openly all throughout the whole process of the Jackson campaigns and the rainbow is that the rainbow had the potential to be the independent form that could bring together the broad cross-section of people in this country, activists, new people getting into the movement, the progressive movement as a whole, that could, we thought, over time, become an independent party. That's what we fought for and struggled for. Now it's a new situation because the National Rainbow is not that. So we need to, we're in the process right now of just assessing that. How do we move now? Because that was a setback, that was a defeat. But we don't think that means we were wrong to have conducted that struggle. The struggle against organizations not being all they can be, the struggle against the tendency of people running for elected office or in elected office to tend to be elitist or to not be committed really to a democratic mass organizing process. I mean, that's got it's a very difficult problem to deal with in this country just because of the strength of the elitist and individualistic forms that we have to contend with, and all of the conditioning that we're subjected to, the plums, the benefits that are given to people. It's a very difficult process. So in trying to, just to sum up on this point, in trying to figure out what I could offer in terms of any ideas on these questions that Greg raised, about the only thing I can really come up with is that we need organizers. We need people who are very committed to building these kinds of organizations that link together elected officials, people running for office, with people who don't have a commitment to that, but who have a commitment to grassroots organizing. That there has to be a conscious commitment to working, say maybe to bring together, in the case of Burlington, people who are the Burlington Progressive Coalition and people who are supportive of the coalition, but are maybe not that active with it, to really work at bringing all of that together into a broader and a more effective organization, and that has to happen around the country. Because of time, I can't really develop these things as much as I'd like, but just the last thing, the last point I want to raise. I think there was something Bernie Sanders said that I felt needed to be spoken to some extent. Bernie talked about Vermont giving leadership to the rest of the country in terms of the movement for an independent party and for taking power. And I encourage that and welcome that and hope that Bernie and other people will continue to be doing that, because I think that what's happening here is very important. And we're doing what we can within our organization and network to help that and support that. But there's a reality that Vermont is a state that is almost all white, almost all European descendant. Some people put it forward. And the reality within certainly the South, within many urban centers where it is a multiracial reality, is that the movement for a third party, for an independent party, is nowhere near as strong as it is here in Vermont. And though there are certainly people in the communities of color, activists who are pushing for and want to see an independent party and are very committed to independent politics, and who are critical of Jesse Jackson and his involvement with the Democratic Party right now, even though that is all true. The reality still is that there are different levels of development on this question at this particular point. Although I think I would think it's likely that possibly fairly soon we might see much more of a momentum coming out of the black community for an explicit independent party politics than has been true up to now. But the caution I would want to raise is that in the process of Vermont people helping to give leadership nationally to this movement for this independent politics movement and for an independent party, be sensitive to the racial dynamics. Be sensitive to coming in out of your experience, which is a very positive and an important one, but also being very sensitive to the politics and the dynamics in other communities of color. Jesse Jackson did incredible things in his 1984 and 1988 campaigns. And if we take a one-sided approach of being critical of some of the things that should be criticized, that have happened recently, it's going to hurt very seriously. My last example, I got a call actually just yesterday from a woman who's active in the peace and environmental movements in New York City, who wanted to talk with me about an idea that is generating in those movements, in the peace and environmental movements in New York City. And that is to try to get a independent third party, or actually be about a fourth or a fifth party in New York, because you have some other mainly kind of rightist parties, the Right to Life Party, the Conservative Party, and the Liberal Party. But there's talk about running, trying to get David Dinkins, the black Manhattan borough president running for mayor right now, to get him to agree that there should be an independent line that would be put on the ballot, so in case, if he doesn't win the Democratic primary, that independent line would be there. And as we talked, it became more and more clear that there was a very real danger in that, because if David Dinkins would win in the Democratic primary, and I don't have time to really speak about David Dinkins and his strengths and weaknesses, but if he would win, and there was also an independent line, the great likelihood is that the work that would be happening in support of in trying to get a vote for David Dinkins as an independent would be coming from white organizers from the peace and environmental movement, whereas the black movement and Latino and other people who are involved with the Dinkins campaign, their energies would be going into getting the vote on the Democratic line. And you could actually set back in New York City, as we were talking, you could set back the movement for an independent politics and an independent party, because you would have essentially a segregated operation taking place this fall after the Democratic primary happens. So I raise that up as an example of the kind of sensitivities that we as white people, because I think almost everybody in this room is white, if not everybody, that we need to have, as particularly as we move out, if people are talking about moving out beyond Vermont. Thank you.
As Greg mentioned, I'm Sandy Baird, and I last spring ran for a Greens candidate for mayor in Burlington. So some of the remarks this morning were addressed, I guess, to me from Mayor Sanders. So I will talk a little bit about my personal experience, why I chose to do what I did, challenge the, quote, most progressive administration, unquote, in the United States, and talk about why I did that and what I perceive the role of the Greens and what I perceive the role of the Progressive Coalition and other progressive organizations to be. First of all, my own experience has led me to always be fundamentally outside the system and fundamentally radical. I've always believed that we had to have an explicitly anti-capitalist movement, that it had to be an ecological movement, that it had to be a democratic movement with a small d, and it had to be a movement interested in social justice. For that reason, in my personal life, I'd been a feminist involved in the women's movement, in the peace movements, and I'd been only peripherally involved in any kind of electoral politics. I early saw that in my view, that the Democratic Party was as bankrupt as the Republican Party. And so in my early years, I did support the administration of Mayor Sanders, his election, and also the Progressive Coalition. But to my dismay, early on in the administration, I found that for whatever reasons, the party could not be explicitly anti-capitalist or ecological or democratic or or really interested in social justice. Although I firmly believe that most members of the Progressive Coalition are interested in all of those issues. I believe, though, that it is the nature of a party itself that sort of negates being very radical. As Mayor Sanders said this morning, I think this is a very telling expression. He said we have to have the courage to take power. When you take power in this country, it seems to me that you are taking power in a capitalist system. You are asking for votes also. And if your primary emphasis is in the electoral arena, and if you are asking for votes, you have to compromise. You have to, for instance, not talk about being anti-capitalist, although you very well might be, in fact, anti-capitalist. But you cannot pursue anti-capitalist programs. In the election, for instance, the Greens stressed growth and unrestrained growth, which is another word for capitalism. And we also mentioned being explicitly anti-capitalist. But if you're looking for votes from the, quote, business community, you can't be anti-capitalist. You can't build a movement with those principles. The same with ecology. If you are pro-capital, if you are pro-growth, you can't also be pro-ecology. You have to link the two. And if you're interested in getting, seizing, and keeping power, you can't do that. You have to make compromises with those forces. The same way I saw that the party could not really be democratic. That in asking for votes, you have to put forward what I like to call charismatic leaders. Most often, frankly, those leaders are male, although I think that charismatic leaders come in both sexes. In the traditional party structure in this country, they have been charismatic males who are often not accountable to any kind of platform or any kind of principles. This was the case, I believe, in the Jackson campaign, who really wanted to run a one-man show, largely, which is why, although I personally love to listen to Jesse Jackson, I went to the Democratic caucus, although I did not vote. He, again, is a very charismatic leader. However, I never knew what his principles were. I never knew what we would get if he was in power. The same with, unfortunately, the leaders of the Progressive Coalition. While the Progressive Coalition itself has many principles, the leaders of it do not run as progressives. So in a sense, voting for them was again voting for an independent male who I didn't know what, in fact, that program would be. And there's very little grassroots democracy within that movement, in my view, or in the Jackson movement. Similarly, social justice is a very hard goal to achieve when you are talking about seizing power. If you are, again, going to accommodate to those forces in the society to get votes, you're going to be in the hands often or making backroom deals with developers. It's very hard to avoid the kind of gentrification that has occurred in cities across this country, and in turn make our cities better for poor people who are largely women and children. So for those reasons, when I saw that our city was not really, while I would say that there were some liberal reforms, those basic fundamental radical issues were not being addressed. And that's why I chose to run in a Greens campaign. And you might ask, why then do the Greens join an electoral campaign if we're not interested in seizing power? We are interested, however, in building a movement that addresses the issue of power. Greens as a whole are interested in building a grassroots democratic movement that is honestly and explicitly radical, honestly and explicitly anti-capitalist. The electoral arena, as I think Barbara said, allows you to do that if you can do those issues honestly. It was for that reason that we went into that campaign. We did bring up the issues of being anti-capitalist, ecological, democratic, and also for social justice. And we had crucial differences on many key issues in that campaign. For instance, our growth, we asked for a moratorium on growth. We asked for democratic neighborhood assemblies to govern the cities. But I think that the difference between the Greens as a movement and a party is simply this issue of seizing state power. I believe that parties traditionally and always have wanted to get power and manage it on behalf of whomever they feel is in their special interest groups. They have not truly been interested in addressing power, eliminating it, and eventually having citizens govern their own lives. And that's the crucial difference to me between the Greens and other and a typical party of any sort, Democrat, Republican, or third party.
Well said. Well said.
Yeah, I wanted to start too with this idea that you challenge for power through the electoral arena. I don't believe you challenge for power through the electoral arena. And people who believe that, I think almost always, if they do, quote, come to power, wind up administering the system. That is, in fact, the real power in the system does not reside where they are in City Hall. It resides with the large corporations, which have enormous power, increasingly enormous power. And so you wind up making the system a little more humane, a little more efficient, perhaps, but you don't fundamentally challenge the basis of power. You don't have power. You have the trappings of power without power. So I agree with Sandy. We're trying to break through the whole idea of what power is, but beyond that, I don't think that they are, in fact, challenging for power. I don't think, contrary to what Bernie Sanders says, he's not accepting power. What he wants to do is accept the trappings of power. And he wants to convince other people that, in fact, he has power when he does not. That is, create illusions. I thought the question of the West German Greens was a very interesting one. I would go further than Brian does. It seems to me it's not only a question of when you enter the electoral arena, you tend to further the illusion that you can change, in a fundamental sense, the way the system operates through elections. That's clearly true. But more than that, without real militant social movements driving a political party, even one which initially was started with close links, that party loses its ties with those movements and moves further and further to the right. So we now see a situation where the West German Greens are giving up their fundamental principles to be in a coalition with the Social Democrats, who in fact have been subsidized by the United States since World War II. So that is a complete dead end if you really want to fundamentally change the system. And you're seeing the same process that we see in a much more extreme way in the Jesse Jackson campaign, but you also see it in the West German Greens. So I would say it's more than just a question of independent politics. You really need a militant social movement pushing forward being the cutting edge of the movement for change. But let me talk a little bit, since we are in the United States and not Germany, about Jesse Jackson and the Democratic Party. Now, I was surprised how much I agree with what Terry said. It seems to me absolutely key, the idea that change occurs through revolutionary breaks, not through small incremental changes. And if you look historically, that is so true. Real fundamental changes happens in a few compressed moments when people are really mobilized, and then there are long periods in which change is reversed. Unfortunately, we're in one of them. If you believe that, why were you wandering into the the Democratic Party caucus, whether they ask you or not? Who cares whether they ask you or not? That's not where fundamental change is happening. Furthermore, Jesse Jackson makes it absolutely, explicitly clear that he stands for the capitalist system. In '84, there could be illusions. There was rhetoric about breaking with the Democratic Party. There was, some black nationalist militant rhetoric. In '88, it was out front. I stand for the system. A more humane system, yes, a more progressive system, but nonetheless, I stand for the system. Jackson couldn't have been any clearer about it. He stood for the Democratic Party. He stood for electoral politics as the way of making change. He stood for capitalism. He was explicit about all of those things. There could be no illusions about that. The guy couldn't have been any clearer about it. He had no business being in that caucus. And if it seems to me that was a sham on both sides. Okay, now, I was also struck by the idea of the New York City example, that one of those, quote, right parties, the Liberal Party, came out of the 1930s, the American Labor Party. Because in the 1930s, Social Democrats who had broken from the principle of independent political action, real independent political action, that is being totally independent of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, they had broken from that and set up the American Labor Party as a scam for getting people who did not want to vote for Democrats, who for years had been outside the Democratic Party, to get them to vote for FDR. That was what the American Labor Party was set up for. Now, as time went, of course, it was going to be for progressive politics within the Democratic Party. As time has gone on, it's been nothing but the crudest kind of electoral scheme where, votes are traded back and forth, and now stands for nothing at all except whatever the clique that's running it is doing. But I'll bet you, if you set up the fifth one of those, the same thing will happen with all the best intentions of the world. That is not an independent party. We don't have to talk about theory in that. That's pure practice. You just have to look at what happened to the American Labor Party and the Liberal Party. Why anyone would want to repeat that practice is beyond me. And certainly let's not use the rhetoric of independent politics. That has nothing to do with independent politics. That is your normal wheeling and dealing in New York City. It goes on every year. There are slots being traded back and forth all the time. If we're going to have independent politics in this country, it has to be totally independent of the Democratic and Republican Party, and it has to be on a genuinely radical platform. And that means a whole lot more radical than Jesse Jackson. I want to give a concrete example, because I don't think anybody here could disagree with this. We have a military budget which is bloated at $300+ billion. Staggering. That is at best wasted, and if it's not wasted, it's going to destroy us. Now, what's Jesse Jackson's solution for this problem? Freeze it. Freeze it at $300 billion? No. Slash it. And I mean really slash it. That's what a radical program would be. Jackson wouldn't get near it. Because if you started raising those kinds of issues, you're going to start running into real strong vested interests. And he didn't want to touch it. I just use that as one example. That's the kind of politics we need if we're going to have a genuinely independent politics.
You've all been very tolerant in the last 45 minutes, and I hope involved. And now, with the panel's permission, rather than go around for another go-around, why don't we just open it up for comments, and then people could talk, and then those of you who want to respond to what's being said in the audience can do so. I'll start in the front and move back. Larry. You speak up if you would, because I have a kind of a poor tape recorder.
My name is Larry Lewack, and my first exposure to Vermont politics was being campaign coordinator for the Citizens Party at the very apex of their power in Vermont in 1982. And we learned a lot from that experience. I don't want to go over any of it here except to bring back one slogan that has rung true for me then and still rings true for me now, which is, the slogan was, "We don't need a new deal, we need a new deck." And I just want to ask the panelists, anyone who cares to respond to this, and also just kind of throw it out today. I've had a couple of ideas, very specific things that we who believe in the possibilities for an independent politics here in Vermont, an independent movement could do, that I've thrown out from time to time, and people have said, yeah, that's an interesting idea, and then we went on to the next liberal reformist campaign, which we all agreed on, and so forth. Well, the two ideas are this. Okay, first of all, let's amend the state constitution, the Vermont Constitution, to create the possibility of citizen initiative so that the people, not just the legislature, could vote on specific legislation and enact specific legislation in the state of Vermont. We cannot do that now. If we could do that, it would create some openings for independent, issues-oriented campaigns to put our issues on the front burner and to get a discussion, not, gee, will the Democrats support it, the Republicans support it, but do the people want it, yes or no? Another idea, could we in Vermont propose an amendment to the state constitution which would abolish the set of election laws that basically make the Vermont legislature a two-party structure, and instead create a system of proportional representation along European parliamentary lines in elections for the Vermont House. In that way, we would be doing something quite radical. We would be saying the reason that we can't succeed under the two-party structure is because the rules are stacked against us. So let's change the rules. Let's say that in Vermont, we want to try something a little different, which is more democratic than what we have now. If we were to succeed in that, and the odds are tremendous against it, but if we were to succeed, we would have an opening here to provide the kind of example to the rest of the country that I think we want to. So I just want to put out that these are two ideas that I've mentioned before, and I want to mention them again here, because I think that they would provide us, if we were successful, with some very valuable openings to make change and provide an example for others. And even if we were not successful in the short run, I think that the kind of debates that putting out these proposals would engender would be very healthy debates. Anyone would take a comment?
I think Terry wants to comment.
Yeah, I think we would all support both those constitutional amendments. The difficulty is constitutional amendments of that nature they're not a good organizing tool, because most people, it's sort of like, it's hard to get them excited about that. Maybe referendum, you could say, voting on things. But the reality is with money dominating the media, money dominating means of communication, direct access to amending the Constitution or enacting laws, it's a fatal flaw for that and for everything else we try and do. I mean, I'm not singling that out. It's no more subject to that than anything else. But it's certainly worth having. And same thing for proportional representation. Proportional representation assumes that you have a valid party system where parties stand for policies and stand for principles that people can identify with. In Europe, they know what the Communist Party stands for, Social Democrats, the monarchists, the whatever. We don't have that. We'd have to create, what that might do is encourage the creation of parties that actually stood for something, which would be kind of great. But the reality is that people, trying to go around and organize people for a constitutional amendment to institute parliamentary democracy, they go, if we had it, I'd love it, but I'm not sure it's an organizing tool to really get there.
Okay, good.
I just said,
I'm sorry.
in California there is a referendum thing, and the problem is money speaks very loud. So while I think it's a reasonable idea, it would have to be, even a first step, it would have to be accompanied by very strict financial limits. Otherwise, that was by it.
I'd like to also point out that we did have the ERA fight here, and money came in and won that one. And that was a constitutional amendment that had a lot of support.
Okay, Peter?
I was hoping Ted would defend why the Democratic Party is a place to work. My name's Peter Youngbear. I'm a state representative from Plainfield, and I'm trying to think who made the comment about 10 years of legislative action, whether it's Terry or Ted, but if that's true, I'm in trouble next time. I was elected in '81. It was the year of the actor. Me and Ronald Reagan came in together. I would, at the risk of being labeled, I will take the position and argue, for lack of this position on the panel, that the Democratic Party is the appropriate place, particularly here in Vermont. And I have a few comments that I'd like to make in response, and they're not in any particular order, to things that have been made by the panelists. And I say particularly here in Vermont, and it brings me to my first comment, which is there has been talk about anti-democratic party in the plenary session this morning and here, and I think it's important to make a distinction about national party politics and state party politics. For example, Terry talked about grassroots and the very personal level of running for alderman. I would suggest that running for state representative is exactly the same size district, and the suggestion that running for state legislature in Vermont is different than running for city government in the city of Burlington is not that great. It involves door-to-door personal campaigning, meeting and talking with the people in a very grassroots way. I would also reject the implication that because I am a Democrat and run on a Democratic label in the state of Vermont for the legislature, that I am an imperialist running dog. However, I think for those of us who are Democrats, who think of ourselves as progressives, profess to be progressives, put forth progressive legislation and progressive voting records, the implication and often the sentiment that we get from the left, from the Rainbow Coalition, from Greens, etc., reflected back to us in the legislature, and I know this is true from talking to other folks who I would label as progressives in the legislature, the feeling is that we are being called imperialist running dogs because we choose to be Democrats. I'll just let that one sit as it will. I would also reject that the statement, and I believe it was fellow in the green shirt, Chester, sorry, that candidates are all virtually alike, running as Republicans or Democrats in most cases in most districts in Vermont. I think that when you get down to the representative level, where it is an intensely personal campaign, those differences are greatly heightened, and the party labels, in fact, have very little meaning. Someone asked the question about electoral involvement, and the issue, Brian, I think, raised it about the nuke waste dump. I think there is a legitimate way for electoral politics to be used and people in office to be used, as I think was demonstrated with the nuke waste dump, particularly when it was going to be put in our backyard, in my front yard, where because you had someone in office, who had, by virtue of a title, for whatever it's worth, access to media, legitimacy in the eyes of the media, credibility in the eyes of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, that it was important in that particular instance that electoral politics and politicians be used by that grassroots population to organize around that event. And that organization was astounding. We turned out in Wells River 46% of the population of 6 towns. Imagine that happening at a meeting in Manhattan. You know, that's staggering. I also think that it is really important, after hearing Tweedledum and Tweedledee from Bernie this morning, and the implications that, you know, really the two major parties are all like, to once again look, and I again focus on the state level. I'm very proud that as a Democrat, we responded, working with Teresa Freeman, with the mini Superfund law, which I was an author of, to change the enforcement procedures and change the agreement that had been negotiated with UniFirst there. To go in and look at workers' rights and community rights and toxics in the workplace and community right to know. To pass in this past legislative session, just as another example, a maternity leave bill. And those are positions that were put forth and argued for and fought by Democrats, not Republicans. There are major differences. You look at minimum wage, you look at Rouse's Point Bridge. I think those differences are lost sometimes in the rhetoric, if you will, of national party politics, where I don't have so much disagreement about differences between the two parties and the vested capital interests. But I think it is a little bit different, and the distinction needs to be made at the state level. I think I've spoken enough.
Well, I'd like to respond that in fact, on state levels, and I think I sat with you at the hearing on the Gay Civil Rights Bill, there are actual, there are, I think, personally, and there are between the parties, some differences. What I would always argue for, though, is that is not the only arena, and that is not the most important arena if you are demanding radical change. That radical change really has to come from grassroots movement, because people are going to be more radical outside the system than those in the system who are dealing with a very rigid and very rich power structure. And so I think that one of the things that has to be realized is that a grassroots movement always has to be active, radical, and very powerful, and to keep the legislature on its toes, regardless of the individual differences within it.
I'd like to.
I think a couple more people.
I started out, I wanted to ask some questions. So, you people talking all the time. All right. I was struck with the first speaker getting down and sitting down there, and she said something about that's uncomfortable for me to be up here. So she sat down there. My question to the rest of you, did you hear that or see that, or what's your reaction to that?
I can tell you, I didn't want to have this workshop in this room. You know, I was
We spent a
opposed
half
to it. I
hour
wanted to
arguing
have a
about
smaller
these
room.
lights,
And,
too. It's
you know,
abominable.
right. It's because of these video cameras, I think. I mean, I think this room, this setting is just a very bad setting.
All I'm saying is that you're for democracy. All of you are, oh my God, am I for democracy. I mean, it's just the greatest thing since Kotex, okay? But you know what I really hear you coming out of you? Dogmatism, every one of you. You got all the answers. You don't have any questions. I can't imagine you really having a grassroots organization in which you have to deal with human beings in which you don't have all the answers.
I got something to say. I say that you can't get any change. It's the individual that has to change. There's been organizations for centuries, from the right, the left, up and down and sideways. And individuals have to change. And when individuals change, it can affect other individuals, and it can spread like that. You just can't force change on people. They have to be willing to change, and they have to have awareness and understanding and compassion. And when people have those things, that begins with love. It leads to love and peace. And some people were saying there's so many issues. Here there is about 40 or 50 different issues. But there is only one issue, and that is individuals can change by themselves, by knowing themselves. And when they have compassion and awareness and understanding, then we can get some real change. And all of these problems are just going to just dissolve by people understanding what the problems are and being aware, and they'll realize that a lot of these things are wrong, and they'll start to change.
I want to start by saying I think different people have different experiences, and therefore they lead to different conclusions and different lessons in their lives. I have a few comments, and they're scattered because I'm not an articulate speaker, but I'll just run through them real fast. I heard it said many years ago that the left is a bunch of little bugs fighting each other inside of a raindrop. And one of my reactions to what I've heard today, and a lot of this is new to me in Vermont, is that the Progressive Coalition over here and the Greens over here, which sound to me very much like they have a basic fundamental agreement in philosophy, are two of those little bugs. Another thing that occurs to me is that I was in Chile when Allende was president. I lived there for a year while he was president, and my experience there is that you need to get into one coalition and fight your internal battles inside that coalition and present a coalesced front to the world. And that's how you get the fast kind of changes in society that this man here in the end was talking about. If you need very rapid change, if you need it in our lifetime, then the only way that I know of that works to get it is to get together and fight your internal battles, but work together out in the world and get it done. And the last thing that I wanted to say is a question that's in my mind, which is what kind of organizing, and I ask anybody here to discuss this, please. What kind of organizing is going to prevent us from, once we are in any way successful, whether it be in electoral politics or union organizing or feminist organizing or any kind of organizing you want to say, once we become in any way successful in any of those forms, what's going to prevent us from getting blown away by the military, which is controlled by the capitalists?
I'm going to just keep recognizing people from the floor for a while, and people up here will respond a little bit later. I think it was somebody over there, but if you're going to, do you want to?
Well, somebody else could go first if they'd like.
Okay. As someone from the southern part of the state, I think the little fight between the Greens and the Progressives is kind of boring for a little bit for us. We've just been hearing a lot of it. And also because I don't even see half the differences. I know there are major problems that people are happening, but I don't really see them. However, I think it was interesting that Terry, who has been very much pushed when you started talking about the getting down to democracy, getting to people participation in government and making votes count, and then seeing your response to the gentleman who said, why don't we have citizen initiative? Well, that would be people aren't too interested in that. Well, it would seem to me that in every level of what Vermont is about, from the democratic town all the way up, a greater emphasis on participatory democracy in the sense of issues and not just representation. I think one of the biggest problems in the state is representation, and the compromises that come through representation. Pragmatic politics take on a lot of compromise, and I think we see that very much so as we get further and further away, and it becomes very smart to be pragmatic. But I think that response to the gentleman who brought that up is a problem. I think throughout all these organizations, there's got to always be much greater democracy and much greater participation. And it would seem to me that a major focus for the state would be the citizen initiative or anything that gets further down there with the financial limitations or whatever, so that big companies can't come in and just buy off these elections. The other thing that I think is kind of silly is this battle between capitalism and anti-capitalism as a litmus test for a progressive independent party. It just doesn't work that way. It seems to me we are in the middle of a capitalist system, and the kind of battles that we're going to have are going to have to be with coalitions and compromises and sort of groups that are going to, that means that we're going to have to work with people who are pro-capitalist, and even though you are anti-capitalist, and many people probably here are anti-capitalist, but that argument seems to me to be kind of a litmus test, a way to attack someone. The Jackson campaign was much greater than whether he was pro-capitalist or not. That kind of stuff are just buzzwords that get people scared or you know, more purist than thou. I think that kind of stuff corners people, and there was a lot of energy and a lot of excitement going on in the black community that capitalism, pro-capitalist, anti-capitalist, had nothing to do with it. There were a lot of some real issues there, and I think people should understand that that was a very important movement. I'd like to find out from Terry a little bit more about the democracy and give him another chance about the Citizens Initiative. I really don't see why you just sort of pass that off. And what is the possibility of it?
I would suggest go a little further with this, and if you would all keep track of the things you want to respond to, and in maybe a few more minutes we'll do another round of the panel. Gene?
Yeah, I guess that in response, just to follow this up, I, as a member of the Burlington Progressive Coalition, I think that I speak for virtually all of the PC in saying we would welcome working with the Greens. Our positions are not that far apart, and we would like to work in coalition, particularly on issues. And it's not only absurd, but it creates a lot more of these problems that end up getting played out in big events like this, when the day after the election, Sandy, who I've known and loved for many, many years and still love her and respect her, says that Burlington is a one-party town, that the Republicans, the Democrats, and the Progressives are all one big party, and that is just so...
You said that you defeated everybody else. I didn't say that you were all the same. You were defeated.
That was what was reported. Maybe. Okay. But...
You wiped out opposition.
Thank you. That is, I mean, it is a totally absurd position when you look at the proposals and the policies and programs that progressives have done in Burlington. The land trust idea, which has now become a state system, was created in Burlington with help from the a Massachusetts firm. We were the pioneers of that in the state of Vermont. We've just passed a Mini Act 250, a condominium conversion, and we all know the heat that Burlington gets for having a foreign policy, where elected officials go to Soviet Union or to Cuba or to Nicaragua. In response to Peter, I think that the real test of the Democratic Party is going to come up next year with the test for Madeleine Kunin, and how the Democratic Party plays that one. I do not believe that Madeline Kunin, and I've known Madeline and tried to work with her since the late 70s, is a representative of the progressive wing of the party, nor do I think she epitomizes progressive politics, although I think that Madeline is a very decent person. So I personally believe that that's a major test that your party will go through. And I too would like, as opposed to me continuing on, like to hear from Barbara and Terry their experiences and how you've used and how the administration has used the power, whatever power you have or whatever illusions to power that you have, to actually empower people. Because I know that there are many concrete examples that that is the case, and I guess I'll save that for later.
Okay, just one quick one. I think some of the frustration you've been hearing out here is the fact that this is a difficult issue to make concrete, and because we're talking about structural change more than even just individual change. Because even if we all got our individual lives in order and composting, all this kind of crap, if the Bank of Boston and Gannett still own this state, we're not going to get our basic needs met. And I think that's why structural change is important. My question revolves around what Walter Lippmann said in '32. He said the crisis of democracy is a crisis of journalism, and that we don't get the information we need as citizens to understand what the choices are. And I was wondering, in terms of what you all are considering in terms of creating an independent party, an independent movement, how we can get the information we need to understand what the real choices are, because of the fact that Gannett has come in, the Bank of Boston come in, and what Barbara said about the ERA campaign and what's happened in California with the experience there in terms of money being able to buy off the situation. How do those experiences inform us about how to keep that from happening in Vermont?
I think we'll go back to the panel for a little while. Maybe start at the end here with Terry.
I can't really answer that one.
How about that one of the ones over there? About the
in terms of initiative referendum, in 1984, I went around the state radio talk shows all over the place campaigning for specifically this issue. This was one of my two issues when I ran in that particular race. Initiative referendum and a state bank, municipal and state control of investment. And the reality is I got like a reaction like a stone. Nobody reacted to that. It's an issue which I support, and I wish we could have it, and I'd be willing to work for it. I'm just talking about the pragmatics of per hour spent on the phone, handing out literature, picketing, per hour spent as an activist doing that, how much can I put forth the progressive and radical direction of the state for that issue as opposed to organizing around some other issue? It's just a pragmatic issue. My experience is I'd rather work on some other issue because I think that there's a greater chance of creating radical change sooner with other issues as taking the focus of it. Because I think that one sounds bureaucratic to the average person, even though I agree fundamentally it's an important thing, and I support it and I'd work for it if there was a real movement to do that. But
able to concentrate in the decision-making process in Burlington itself into some form of participatory democracy. I know I can understand maybe for the host state, but being in the local government, have you been able to?
Well, if you look at the ballots in Burlington over the last 8 years since we've been in power, and even before we've been in power, every single ballot has people complain to us all the time about how many issues are on the ballot. We're voting on El Salvador. We're voting things that are not necessarily binding. A lot of them are binding. Rent control, issues of changing the tax reform to make it so that low-income people and elderly people did not have to pay property taxes. All kinds of very fundamental and radical issues we put on the ballot. We've tried to democratize it. We created the neighborhood planning assemblies as grassroots neighborhood town meetings. They haven't come to fruition as we had hoped, but there's a lot of issues involved with all that. I mean, and to say that we're sounding like we're just issuing a lot of political jargon or dogma. I'm sorry. I mean, I read too much of this kind of material, so those words might come to my mouth a little bit too readily. But I am engaged in as grassroots democracy politics as you can be. I mean, I'm talking with people around the neighborhood all the time. I'm organizing people all the time. And Gene's question about what we do, I mean, we want to talk about constituency base. I mean, we're not, in the Progressive Coalition, a think tank. I wish sometimes we did spend more time thinking, but the reality is that all our time is spent organizing people on a day-to-day basis in their places of work and in around neighborhood issues, around renters' rights, trying to get tenants' organizations formed, trying to organize pickets of landlords. I mean, we're involved with such grassroots politics every day that we don't have time to print all the nice, books and literature that a lot of other left organizations are able to do. And I'm sorry if it offends someone as sounding dogmatic. I'm labeled as one of the dogmatic people in the city of Burlington because I am one of the few who has said consistently, yes, I'm a socialist. When a reporter asked me, he said, yes, I'm a socialist. They never bother to print it because I never defend myself. In Burlington, it's sort of interesting. We've been able to really pretty much eliminate red baiting, and that's something I think we can all appreciate. Red baiting is dead in Burlington because it doesn't work. Because once they charge you with being a socialist or communist, and you say, "Oh yeah, that's what I am," they go, they can't think of anything else worse, and you already have admitted it. So in Burlington, they've given up on that. So.
I think Sandy wanted to.
But Gene brought up an interesting point about coalitions, and I believe in coalitions, but I always would ask for what? What are we coalescing about? For instance, the Greens have always worked in coalitions on the Alden Plan, against the Alden Plan that was sponsored by the city. We are now trying to form a coalition against Hydro-Quebec, and also trying to form an anti-growth coalition that's countywide. But I think when you're talking about coalitions, you always have to ask for what? Is it to elect a charismatic male, or is it an issue that is fundamentally radical? If it is an issue that is fundamentally radical, then I think that the coalition is something that would interest, well, the Greens, certainly.
Are there examples where you've done that? Worked in the progressive community and coalitions that you might have agreed on?
We are very active in the just cause eviction. We would love to have rent control. The city has abandoned rent control. We worked in a coalition against the 4-year term that was proposed by Madeline Kunin. If we want to talk about democratic reform, we worked with citizens groups that were for keeping the 2-year term. I work very actively in feminist coalitions, but I always would ask the question, what is this coalition for? Is it going to be to elect politicians who are going to govern us, or is it going to be a coalition that is anti-capitalist and is going to allow us, in the end, to govern ourselves?
Brian?
I think there are a tremendous number of creative, talented, radical people at all levels of political activity in Vermont, and I think there's no question that having people like Peter and Terry in the positions that they're in has the potential of opening up possibilities for all of us to do the work that we want to do better. It also has the potential of reinforcing the habits that people in this country who get their politics from TV take for granted, that the way you're involved in politics is by electing somebody to do your politics for you, or hiring somebody as a city official to do your politics for you. And if what we're concerned about is fundamental change, we have to be really clear, both those of us that are engaged in electoral politics and those of us that aren't, that just isn't enough, and really start thinking about ways we can work with people that transcend some of those old divisions. And I think the example that Peter raised of the nuclear waste dump issue was one where the politicians really did follow the groundswell of the people in a way that is a pretty good model. But that kind of involvement of people in issues can't be limited to those emergency situations, because otherwise we fall back into the whole backroom scene. And if we're talking about real change, that's just not acceptable.
Yeah, I think that obviously it's important for there to be coalitions around issues. The question is which issues and on what basis. To me, coalitions that make sense are coalitions that are around radical issues, that actually begin to challenge the fundamental assumptions of the society. And I found it interesting, a person commenting on Jesse Jackson, the specific point I actually raised was the military budget. Shouldn't a candidate we support be for slashing the military budget? Now, to me, that begins to raise a radical analysis. It's not explicitly anti-capitalist, but in this particular capitalist society, it's a very radical demand. And I raised that very concretely. It wasn't abstract about it at all. I was very concrete, and it's interesting it was not responded to. And I find that over and over again with Jesse Jackson. People don't want to really talk concretely, what was he for? And I'll go through other issues if you want to. I mean, he deliberately avoided making radical stands over and over again. For another example, he didn't want to talk about the CIA at all. His advisors told him that would be too touchy.
Why are you surprised at all this?
Fine, okay, that's good. If we can all agree on that he stands for the system as it is, that's fine. Then everybody who gets up and says, I was for Jesse Jackson, I realize he was for the system as it is.
Well, we do. We're not that simple. We knew that he was not for anything but less than a freeze. I mean, that he was for freeze. We participated knowing full well what he stood for. It wasn't like we're dumb. You're not giving us any information here. We knew he wasn't anti-capitalist.
On one hand, say that you're for radical change and you're for the electoral arena to raise radical change, and then to work ardently for a candidate who very consciously and explicitly is not for radical change. I find that a contradiction in terms.
For the kind of movement and the direction we're going in on that campaign.
Right, well, on top of that, it was completely top-down, charismatic, all of those things. I find that completely, I mean, apparently you don't. I find that Hudson, let me just wanted to respond to the imperialist running dog. I think it's a mistake generally for people on the left to use those kinds of buzzwords. For instance, for Bernie Sanders to say that people who are opposed to him are, quote, sectarians. For people who are opposed to him to say that he is an opportunist. To people opposed to you to say you're an imperialist running dog. None of those seem to be very fruitful, right? They're just buzzwords. You're not really substantively answering a real point. On the other hand, to the extent that nice local Democrats worked for and told other people to vote for Michael Dukakis, well, I got to tell you, Michael Dukakis, in my book, I'm from Massachusetts, most certainly does support imperialism, most certainly does support capitalism in the whole sense of that word. And if you're going around urging people to vote for him, yes, I'm going to say to you, you're urging people to vote for the capitalist system, and I'm completely opposed to that. And I don't think that's using buzzwords. I think that's a political analysis.
I think we're all pretty much agreed that the electoral system can't produce any radical change. I mean, don't most people agree that the electoral system can't produce radical change?
This is getting, please, people, everyone wants to talk now. I want to let Ted talk for a moment, then go back to the audience.
In response to Eric, the civil rights struggle was about a very reformist issue, and that was the right of people to vote. But the civil rights struggle had an incredible impact upon the political life of this country that we're still feeling today. And I think it's probably true that without that very reformist, non-radical, in terms of the basic issue and the basic, it was radical, but it was not. It was not, as you say, around a radical issue. It was around the right to vote. Right? The right to vote.
No, that's not my memory.
Second point, the sister over here I thought raised an important point. She asked, how do we, what I wrote down, saying, what keeps us from getting blown away by the military? Well, we should remember what we're living in here. We're living in the United States of America. And it seems to me that in terms of strategy and tactics for overturning the system and bringing into being one that is socialist or whatever you would call it, we have to keep that in mind, and it seems to me that's where it's very important for us. The brother said that what I was saying was that against working with people in the Democratic Party, and I didn't say that. We believe that it is important for people who are clearly independents and who are working at building independent movement and organization to work with people who are in the Democratic Party who are willing to work with us and who have basic agreement on the issues. Because, as the sister says, if we don't build a broad-based movement that utilizes electoral tactics, grassroots organizing, direct action, initiatives, every kind of tactic, all the arenas of struggle, if we don't learn how to do that, then this military won't even have to move against us because we won't be effective enough to have a chance of winning, of taking power, of taking the existing system and beginning to change it and transform it.
John.
I think one of the biggest problems that any really successful radical political leader has in the world today, and my history isn't all that good, so I could be wrong if I say something, but I look at Lenin, I look at Franklin Roosevelt, and I look at, maybe to a lesser extent, Ronnie Reagan, and all three of those people came along and said one thing, and the minute they got in office, they tried and did something else. Now, Jesse Jackson, I think Jesse Jackson just knew that he had any chance. He had to get in office. And he sure as hell wasn't going to get in office if he did all the things you wanted him to do. But I'll bet had he been elected, boy, we'd be on a radical change track this country hadn't seen for a long time.
Why do you believe that?
Why do you believe that?
Well, if that many people would vote for a black man in the first place, if that many people were supportive of even some of the projects that are going on, it would be such a fundamental change in the consciousness, as we get back to the gentleman here, in their minds in the first place. There's such racism and such sexism and so many other things in people's minds in the first place. To get to that leap would be a consciousness change that other things would come along with it. I think the reality is that Jackson could get elected, but it didn't mean that we couldn't support him and didn't work for him just because that we could still work for him and go through that consciousness and that change that's going on, especially in the black community.
I think there's a comment here.
Yeah. I just was wondering, you know, you're all talking about seizing power and all sorts of things like that, change. It seems to me that we have the power, even though I may be a little naive. The people and their acceptance of everything that's in front of them is a power that we give to them. And that if we start refusing to accept the things around us, which I'm sure most of you have already done, so maybe I'm naive in thinking that something as simple as that can change things. But if people started accepting, knew that they had a responsibility, and that they had this power which gave them the responsibility to act, then maybe they would start doing things. You know, maybe you would start getting more participation, but somehow they have to end up being taught that they don't just elect people to do something for them, but that they should be doing it themselves.
I think that's really critical. Is that people have to learn that you're right. They have to exercise the power that they already have.
Right, we're giving it to the corporations by buying all the garbage that they're feeding us.
Right. I think we're also giving it to political leaders
and
to
banks
acting
and insurance
to govern us.
I think we have a couple comments over here. I'll get back to you.
Yeah, somebody over here said, don't we all believe that the electoral system is that's how we win power? And I think maybe especially the people from the Greens could speak to this. I believe that the electoral system is a means to organize people, to raise their interest in the issues, to raise their consciousness in order to have a revolution.
Right.
You can't get power through electoral politics, and we have to be really clear about that.
And the kinds of individual changes that you were talking about
Thought you might.
are a first step, but what we need is the kind of movement that can make it possible for whole communities to make fundamental decisions to disengage from the system and do that in a way that allows them to act against the system.
I think there's some more comments from the floor, some people who haven't spoken yet. The woman in the middle there, did you raise your hand? No? Over there then.
Okay, I was going to suggest we have to think about coalitions in the electoral arena and other coalitions a little bit differently. Coalitions around particular issues can involve a lot of people because we agree on that discrete issue. If we go into the electoral arena, we're presenting basic direction for society. And when they left, it's in coalitions with the center. In that arena, the left disappears. Because in this society, until it's transformed, the stronger pole of that coalition is going to be the center. So the left will be supporting liberal reform. And that's where the coalition is difficult. So what I'm saying is you got to think about coalitions differently in the electoral arena versus an issue where everybody who agrees on it would get together and work for that issue. And I think that's the difference between why you should not support Jesse Jackson for the system and why you should support civil rights, even if it involves, everybody but the Ku Klux Klan and that working for that civil right. And it's true that working for that civil right may shake up the system. Supporting Jesse Jackson who supports the system does not shake up the system. I think it's a little different in those two arenas.
Someone behind there? You're part of it.
I would add to that and say that the civil rights movement was not about giving blacks the right to vote. That was only its manifestation on the federal electoral level. And in fact, the civil rights movement was about the right for people to stand next to each other in the back of a bus or to eat with each other in a restaurant in Alabama, and that that the electoral strategy, again, is just one manifestation of a larger movement that that we're all part of. That's all. I just wanted to just say that about the civil rights.
But it wasn't anti-capitalist. That was my point. It was not an anti-capitalist movement. It was not a consciously radical movement. Parts of it were. But important parts of it. Well, that's good.
If the panel don't mind, there's still a few more people in the audience, then we'll come back and maybe everyone can say a few more words. Gene, and then the fellow behind, and the woman right there.
I want to respond to the comment that we're only in electoral politics to educate people. And it ties in with this disparaging remark around quote-unquote sewer socialism. That is, that people who are in elected office really only can educate and can't do any good. And as an elected official in the city of Burlington, I know that on a very small issue like putting a stop sign into an intersection where kids had been hit consistently because it's a major thoroughfare from Burlington to Winooski. It's the only way actually to get in from the north end of town, and it crosses through the housing project, that the way that I helped those people organize was an empowering victory for them, because we got the stop signs. We got it in a way that they organized themselves, that they used me, and they used the connections that I had with the bureaucracy. And
But you didn't eliminate capitalism in Burlington.
Absolutely not. It did not eliminate, and but I tell you something. When I see that little black kid who got hit from with that car, from that car that was trying to get across to that Roosevelt Park, I'm real happy that other kids can cross that street to go from the Boys Club to Roosevelt Park. When I see those people, and I see them know that if the people get together and organize themselves, that they can do something.
So
I
you
feel
use politics
that's
to empower
right.
people.
That's right. And
So
I use
then they can go ahead and
absolutely, and I use the power of an elected official, because make no mistake about it, if they had knocked on that door and they told me, "You're never going to get this thing. You're never going to get that stop sign. We have petitioned, we have asked years after years after years, but I said, we will get it. And I will use the power I have, and you will use the power that you have, and together we're going to get that." And I did use the power that I had with the Public Works Commission, which made that decision. I used the power that I had with Bernie Sanders over the budget to say, we need money for crossing guards in that. If we did not have that, if it was the same old gang under Gordy Paquette that had ignored them for at least a decade, they would have organized themselves and run up against it. Maybe they would have gotten it, but past experience was no. I think that the challenge is the use of power in an empowering way. And I believe that the progressives in Burlington have done not a perfect job, but a very good job at that. We would like, and I think I speak for us as an organization, to continue to not just rest on our laurels, but to expand in a way which can incorporate in issue coalitions and in electoral coalitions the people that espouse the same values. And I believe that the Greens in the city of Burlington, to a large extent, do share those values, and would like to see a situation so we could get a majority of the Board of Alders. Because if you don't think there could be, if you think that there were good things happening, or you think that things were slow, now if we got a majority on the Board of Alders in the city of Burlington, there would be a lot that we could do. And I make that plea again. I mean, no, I think that the radical transformation, every day we get up and we eat, and then we work and go to sleep, and we have to do it all over again. So while we can make structural change, we still got to do it every day. We got to get up every day, and life goes on. And so all these things are ahead of us. They're all challenges, and we should really work on those values together. I do believe that there can be fundamental coalition with us. I would hope so. Unfortunately, I don't hear that coming from the other side, but I keep throwing that out. We do.
Okay, Gene, please.
Yes.
Enough. Fellow behind.
Just on the election arena, the idea that somehow you're just electing an individual. I would also say that when you run it like a presidential campaign, or an individual is running for a candidate for a position, usually they do put together a coalition of interests and issues. And so that for Jackson, when Jackson was running, I was supporting him through the gay and lesbian issue, the peace and justice issues. There were a lot of other issues that were involved in the Jackson campaign and in other political campaigns, and that your support went with those issues, and that there was the potential, as in all coalitions, to withdraw your support if the issue itself isn't forthcoming from the candidate. So that there is a give and take there in a political election campaign that is based on issues, not just based on charismatic popularity or personality. You hope that those characters can help bring your issue ahead because of that. And there are a lot of individuals who get involved on issues because of just the issue in elections.
And down here. Sorry you had to wait so long. Yeah.
At first I was hearing a lot about individual people, individual parties. It sounds like a lot of the ways people are thinking around personalities and good people and bad people. And I'm starting to hear now really an alternative that I would rather see, and that is coalitions around values and around agendas, around issues. I would encourage the Burlington Progressives to work with the Greens in every way they can where there's common values and there's common agendas. And I would encourage the Greens to try and do that with the Progressives. It's easy to dismiss any single person or any single group by saying they are imperialists, they're supporting the capitalist system. There's a lot of ways we can dismiss each other, but there's a lot of ways that we can find things in common to work with. Those of us who supported Jesse Jackson, we're not in agreement with everything that he stood for by any means, but we found some common values and common agenda items that we can work together on. And I would encourage the Greens and the Progressives to do the same.
I want to bring it back up to the group up here. Bob, we only have about 10 minutes left. The opportunity for
This is sort of a sum up. I listened pretty thoroughly. I'll just sit back down here. Once again, I feel like we have a large job to do here. We've got a lot of directions to go. And the bickering and the internecine kind of discussions, I'm more radical than you. I don't think really get us very far. So I agree with all of you when you say that. And just urge us to continue to work together where we have things in common, and we have so much in common. So I look forward to seeing all of you through the weekend. Goodbye.
Yeah. Right. Well, I think that Howard's right. The electoral arena is different than the non-electoral arena, but I think even in the non-electoral arena, where we're working around issues that are moving people into direct action, that the differences we're talking about are not minor, they are not sectarian, they're not petty. They reflect real substantive differences in the civil rights movement, which I went through personally. I know is a good example of that. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had a completely different strategy than Martin Luther King. I know you're not supposed to say that these days. Martin Luther King is right up there, right? I mean, no one's supposed to. But the fact is that at the time, there were vehement disagreements with Martin Luther King's strategy, and I agreed with those disagreements, and SNCC had a totally different strategy, which involved, among other questions, the Democratic Party, surprisingly enough, because it wasn't just about the right to vote. Once you got the right to vote, who are you going to vote for? And SNCC said, not those lousy Democrats who have been oppressing us all along. We're going to create an independent party. And they tried to do that. But there were other issues as well, of militancy, of how you can, we can go through it. Those issues keep coming up. When you have a real social movement, there are real disagreements in strategy and in tactics, and they can't be covered over.
Okay, I hope, for myself, out of this conference, that I hope there is some kind of solidarity that comes out of the conference, both for progressives, for Greens, for all other leftists all over the state. Certainly that this is not a local issue, it is a statewide issue. And I hope that that solidarity is built on a common agreement on values and issues, and not on who we're going to next cast our vote for, whether it be Jesse Jackson or Bernie Sanders or whoever else might come down the pike and ask us to trust him. He might do it okay for us. I hope that we come out of here with common values, common issues, And in my own heart of hearts, I hope that those values and issues are fundamentally radical. Radical on the issue of capitalism, on the issue of ecology, on the issue of democracy, and on the issue of feminism and social justice. Because I believe that the world is at a crisis that cannot be solved by managing capital better, by being a good government. And I don't deny what Jean has said. I think that the progressives in Burlington have been a decent government. But I don't think that those reforms are going to solve the ecological crisis, the crisis in the third world, or the crisis in democracy that we have now. We have to have a fundamentally radical movement around issues.
Well, I agree with a lot of what the sister has said, although I think where I disagree is really on certainly tactics and maybe strategy. I don't believe that you can build the kind of mass movement that's needed and the kind of independent party eventually that can really challenge for power in this country unless those of us who are socialists, those of us who are radicals, or whatever, however we describe ourselves, are able to work with people who aren't radicals, aren't socialists, don't agree with maybe a chunk of what we believe in. And that it seems to me that one of the strengths of the movement in Vermont, and one of the reasons I wanted to be at this conference, was because you all have been effective at building a movement that's openly socialist, that's radical, that's elected people to office, that's been able to give leadership to the country politically, showing that masses of working class people and poor people are open to an independent socialist alternative. And that's the kind of movement we need. I guess that's so. I'd like to thank Greg for inviting me.
There's two more people, but I would like to apologize for the room. We did not pick the room that we're in here, and we did debate how we could make it a little bit more humane. Hopefully the next time we meet we'll have a little more control over that. And also, before I go on, I want to thank all the panelists for coming and thank all of you for being here. Go ahead.
I think we're coming out of a period of tremendous low expectations and low motivation around political involvement on all kinds of levels. And it's clear that a lot of the things that we've been talking about and continue to talk about at this conference and in the work that we do represent steps toward really breaking out of the strictures of the last 10 years or so and really putting out a different sense of what's possible. I think while we acknowledge the contributions of people whose main work is within the system, we need to be clear that the system is ultimately not going to solve our problems for us, and that we need to find ways to create a movement that can help people find their way out, that can help break some of those dependencies and break some of those limitations that force people in their daily lives to live the way the system wants us to live. And that means change on the personal level, it means change on the community level, and ultimately it means the kinds of alliances that can create the kind of changes that we need globally. And I also want to add that there are a tremendous number of active Greens and possibly thousands of green-thinking people in Vermont who share a lot of people's concern and frustration and confusion, who, on the one hand, have tremendous solidarity and agreement in principle with the things that Sandy and the other Greens in Burlington have been saying, but who have tremendous problems also, as many people here, with the tenor of the debate that's been going on between the Greens and the Progressives.
I hope people can appreciate that I've avoided making any reference to the Greens at all, or anything I've said. But anyway, talking about, I don't know, there's so many questions I wanted to respond to, and I'm supposed to wrap up, so I'm not sure which one to do, but I just had to make a few comments. I couldn't resist. Talking about the military budget, cutting the military budget as being a sign of a really radical thing. Just so people know, the City Council of Burlington, by a vote of 11-2, including Republicans and Democrats, voted to cut the military budget of the government by $45 billion and transfer that to housing. This is something, you know, a 15% cut in the military budget. So that's not necessarily a radical test anymore. But what that does show is that in Burlington, the center of the debate has been shifted far to the left of what the New York Times or any other mainstream newspaper would ever even consider left-wing fringe. In other words, the center has moved dramatically to the left, and that is not valueless. The issue of personal change, and it comes from the personal level and so on, it's important to know that that's true, but that it's necessary but not sufficient. If we were to convert to vegetarianism, feed more grain for feeding people, the net effect of that within a capitalist economy is that a lot of farmers would go out of business. But since food is a commodity sold to the highest bidder, starving people would still starve to death because it's an issue of power and of capital and of markets, not an issue of lifestyle. And it's important to understand the connections. The political is personal, but the personal also has to be political. You have to engage in a political process, however you define it, whether it's electoral or street demonstrations or whatever. The final point I wanted to make is the trappings of power. I don't wear trappings very well. I'm an elected official. I'm a city councilor for 8 years and so on. And it's true that to a large extent we only have the appearance of power and not much of that appearance, because we know that the bankers and the large multinational corporations are still in fundamental ways running the economy, the city of Burlington. We are allowed by law, by state law, and by the power of the police and of the courts and of the army to deal with this area of things. We want to be dealing with all of this, but we're only allowed to deal with this. So that's true. We have not seized power in that sense. But when we're talking about revolutionary changes, we're talking about not seizing power necessarily, but gaining power, distributing power in a much broader way. In the city of Burlington, however, electoral politics, two people I actually quote. One is Engels, said, one of the worst things a revolutionary can do is get elected before it's time for the revolution, because then all you can either do is administer the system and sell out, or fail. Either way, you lose. And I'm reminded of that constantly when I'm dealing with things like parking regulations and so on. The other argument, though, is that of Teddy Roosevelt. He said, the presidency is a bully good pulpit, or not an exact quote, but basically it's a great place from which to make points that otherwise don't get made. We're on TV every week, us Board of Aldermen, talking about radical issues. I mean, we talk about Nicaragua, we talk about imperialism, we talk about capitalism every single week on public television because we have an elected officials. We're in the newspaper talking about press releases condemning Leahy for supporting Contra aid, etc., etc. It is significant. It's not the solution, and I think we've all agreed that winning elective office on a municipal level, even on a state level, perhaps even on a national level, is not fulfillment of the revolution, but it's a necessary part. You can't ignore it. You have to do that as well. And a final thing, I hope that out of this day, out of this solidarity thing, down the road, we're going to end up with, if not a third party, a third political movement independent of the Democratic and Republican Party, which will challenge and contend for political power in the state. Thank you.